Record this. All right, welcome everybody. I'm Keith Siska, the founder of Last Call Bar Academy, and I've been teaching test prep for 20 years and been in legal education for many years. And today I want to talk about a topic that seems to interest many people, which is cultural bias, and whether the LSAT is susceptible to cultural bias. All right, so I'm going to share my screen with you guys so that I can do a presentation that I've prepared. Just some notes to keep me on track. Okay, here we go. So the first thing I wanted to do was just start with some understanding of what are we talking about here? What the heck is cultural bias? And the most consistent definition that I seemed to get after a few searches was that it means that we're interpreting or judging something by the standards of one particular culture. So in the context of the LSAT, I suppose that would mean that the LSAT is gauging students from the perspective of white culture and ignoring minority cultures. That's the argument. So I went out and started looking for who's making this argument, what claims are they making, and how credible are those claims? And I found that one of the biggest critics of the LSAT is this tax law professor from Monroe College. I mean, a quick Google search will reveal several of his articles. And so Harvey Gilmore writes about the biases that he perceives in the LSAT. And one of them I find to be really fascinating, and that's the historical origins of standardized testing, which is something that admittedly I was completely naive to as a student, completely naive to as a test prep instructor for many years. And it was only sort of late in my teaching career that I started to become aware that some people believed that standardized testing had a nefarious origin. I can't really say that I know the history of standardized testing well enough to corroborate this or disconfirm it, but it wouldn't surprise me if this were true about the origins of standardized testing, that it was based on an assumption that Northern European whites were intellectually superior to other races. I mean, if we think back 100 years to the origins of standardized testing, it wouldn't surprise me if that was the origin of everything created in that era. So this isn't a surprising statement to me. What I'm really interested in is, has standardized testing evolved along with our cultural norms to become fairer and less discriminatory than it perhaps was intended to be or once was? The historical origins of it, while they may be troubling, aren't sort of a nail in the coffin for me that would suggest we just get rid of the whole thing altogether. But then Harvey Gilmore continues on in this article that I was reading, where he says, the LSAT is actually not a good predictor of success in law school. Now you've got my attention, because I'm really interested in, does the LSAT work? Is it going to tell us who will do well in law school? It's what it's intended to do, predict success in law school. And I wanted to see a discussion about the statistics here. And instead, Harvey Gilmore talks about his personal story, the fact that he got a 142 and the schools looked past it, and he was successful in law school and became a big shot law professor. And at this point, I became completely deflated, because I thought to myself, that's completely irrelevant. The story of one chap doesn't tell me anything about whether the LSAT is a good tool for admissions. There may have been individual things about this guy that enabled him to overcome his, difficulties with the LSAT. But so what? Do people with his LSAT score typically get in? Do they typically perform well? Do they typically pass the bar exam? Do they typically become big shot law professors? No, typically they don't. I mean, maybe we could go more granular into each of those questions, but the final result, I mean, legal academia is a really esteemed group, and there's very, very few people in that group who started off with, such stakes against them from the beginning of the process. So I find this personal anecdote business to be so uncompelling and actually very trite, sort of a logical error on the order that the LSAT exposes. I mean, the LSAT frequently tests, like, is an anecdotal data better than statistics? Basically, his argument is my uncle smoked for 100 years and didn't get cancer, so let's all light up. Like George Burns did it. Why shouldn't I? I find it to be rather absurd. So I had to keep searching. All right. Is there some evidence of some cultural bias? There is a better piece of right. Oh, let me go back a second, because Harvey Gilmore in this article, he's arguing against a proponent of the LSAT who I found to be even more distasteful than Harvey Gilmore. And I refuse to even put his name or his research in my presentation, despite the fact that he's on my side. I'm typically pro LSAT and pro standardized testing. But the biggest proponent of this, I found him to be rather objectionable and provocative in the way he discusses this issue. So I didn't want to discuss his research, but I did want to discuss, the reason I bring him up is because he's another law professor. And I find the debate between these two law professors to be so trite. And I find that the real powerful arguments are the ones that are being made by this writer, Latasha Hill, who isn't a professor at all. She's a voting rights advocate and probably a lawyer. So here's what she has to say in her law review article, which I found far more interesting, far more insightful, far more based in reason, and actually did press me to think about the fairness of the LSAT. She says that there's a staggering LSAT score gap between white and minority test takers. But not only that, I think we're all sort of aware that minorities perform more poorly academically, more poorly on standardized tests, blah, blah, blah. But here's what's really true. This gap has remained true for decades, and it consistently appears in a variety of data from different sources. I mean, I was really shocked when I found out how many different ways they have tried to parse this data to look for something other than race or ethnicity to explain the results. So Latasha Hill says, all right, here's how the LSAT has a discriminatory impact. We can look at the data all we want, but let's talk about mechanism. What are the ways in which minorities are impacted here? She thinks that the lower scores that minorities receive are due to these factors and cites a bunch of research to support it. One, prior educational, sorry for the typo, prior educational disparities. This is what I've been arguing for many years, that the LSAT is a thermometer that takes the temperature of students' education, their prior knowledge, and that if minorities are performing more poorly, it's because they weren't educated as well as their white counterparts. That argument could be made maybe until 1981. We'll talk about some of the data that rebuts my position. But still, it's hard to argue that your background education wouldn't impact your LSAT score. Other things that will impact its socioeconomic status, minorities tend to have lower socioeconomic status. And so any correlation that we find in LSAT score and minority status is going to also correlate with socioeconomic status. So how do we tease that apart? Then there's this issue, biased questions, which is one I want to talk about a little more in a moment. So let's put that one on the back burner. Family structure is kind of like socioeconomic status. There are particular family structures that are correlated with white versus minority families. And therefore, those correlations are going to exist with the LSAT score too. And now we have a bunch of complicated data to try to tease out. All of these factors are playing in to the score gap. And then finally, one that I find really interesting, the stereotype threat, which is a psychological phenomenon that individuals who are minorities will feel when they're performing tasks that are traditionally, stereotypically bad for their particular minority. I can't even begin to think about what this would entail, but if minorities are thought to typically perform poorly academically, I guess this would be a good example, then the idea is that there's an added psychological pressure when they are doing academic tasks. And that even if they are sort of equally equipped to perform the task, this additional psychological weight will impact their scores. That one I find to be kind of an interesting argument, but some of these arguments I think are actually cutting against criticisms of the LSAT. If educational disparities, socioeconomic disparities are causing people to have poorer educations, we want the LSAT to reflect that. I mean, that's that. If you haven't developed the knowledge and the skills, we don't want the LSAT to correct for that, or at least I don't think we do. We would want the law schools to correct for that, or we would want the admissions process to correct for that and weigh the LSAT less heavily. So to me, those are not criticisms of the LSAT so much as they are criticisms of the way that law schools use the LSAT to make admissions decisions. But we have to place our criticism carefully here, because if you blame the LSAT when the problem is really how the law schools are using the LSAT, then you miss an opportunity to use the LSAT in a productive way yourself. We'll talk about that on the back end of the presentation. But here's where I think things get really interesting. There's a 1981 study that tried to parse this score gap more carefully by saying, what if we compare minority applicants with similar white college graduates, same college, similar GPAs, and then we track their LSAT scores. Now that's an interesting concept, because now it's harder to say, yeah, well, this guy had a better education than that guy when their GPAs in college were similar and they went to the same school. But what's interesting is that the score gap remains. Still, the minority counterparts tend to score lower than the white test takers. So they parse the data further. I mean, this is incredulous, right? It can't be the case that equally educated people score differently just because of race. So they continue digging further and say, all right, what if it's their major then? Some whites tend to major in this, and minorities tend to major in that, and this major is prepping you better than that one. So they get more granular in how they parse the data. What if we only compare people with the same major, same college, same GPA, but one's a minority, one's a white? They do all these regression statistical analyses, and still the score gap persists. So, people like me who find standardized testing to be valuable and fair are sort of left scratching our head saying, how? Why? It's bizarre that you could try to correct for socioeconomic status, for educational disparities, for all of the things on this list, and yet still we see a score gap. What in the world is going on? Okay, so here's the next thing I want to talk about is, what do we expect the LSAT to do? What skills should it test? And if you look at LSAT's website, they list the top 15 skills as reported by a survey of faculty from 90 law schools. So they took a whole bunch of law professors and said, what are the skills that you think make a law student successful? And here's the top 15 of them. And then LSAC has added which sections of the LSAT they think are testing these particular skills. I mean, this is really an argument for, is the LSAT, does it overlap well with the skills that are going to be important for law school? Number one skill in law school, reading critically. And they claim that the LR and the RC sections are going to test that skill. I would argue that logic games does too. I don't know why you don't have to read critically on logic games. In fact, it's sort of the first tool toward learning how to read critically. Reading critically might be paraphrased as reading carefully. And John Richardson's here in the meeting. We are organizing a podcast that I think we'll record next week on what does it mean to read carefully? Because Brad Barbe, one of the tutors in the group, had commented that if you could just read carefully, that would solve 90% of your problems. And I think one of the issues with that statement is that we have to be more granular and more specific. How exactly is a student supposed to read critically or read carefully? Okay, second most important skill, applying a statute to new facts. And LSAC thinks the LR and RC are testing that skill. Next one, identifying the statute operating in a case. Again, LR and RC. The next one, identifying the key facts in a case, LR and RC. Now I want to pause and talk about those two for just a second. The key facts and the statute operating in a case. Why are those 3 and 4 on the list? You might think, geez, shouldn't it be obvious what statute we're working with? Doesn't the case tell you the facts that are relevant to the case? But what they're trying to indicate, the law professors, by ranking these so highly on the list, is that these are the components of legal reasoning. Legal reasoning is an analog of syllogism. You have to have a minor premise and a major premise to form a valid argument. To form a legal argument, you must have facts and a rule or a statute. So it's not just about saying there it is, but identifying its significance within the argument. How do these two things interact to justify the conclusion that the court reaches? It's the interplay between 3 and 4 that I think is really important. And I think that the LSAT is testing that skill in a meaningful way, if you'll allow it to. The next one, inductive reasoning. I find this one really interesting too. Inductive reasoning could basically be a paraphrase of causation. That's how the LSAT tests or samples, I guess, or another way they test inductive reasoning. But there aren't a lot of good materials out there about causation. LR and RC have a really heavy dose of causal arguments. The next skill, can you read your class materials effectively? I mean, really every section is about effective, careful reading. What about the next one, arguing logically and persuasively in writing? I find this one to be really interesting because some people will say, look, the LSAT doesn't test some skills that are actually going to be important in law school. And LSAC responds and says, yes, we do. We have a writing section. Yeah, but it doesn't factor into the score. So in other words, the score doesn't measure your ability to argue logically and persuasively in writing. That would have to be measured separately with an analysis of the writing section. And I think traditionally, law schools were not particularly interested in the writing section. They valued the score much more heavily. So we could say, okay, is this a flaw in the way that the law schools are using the data or a flaw in the test itself? Here's where I'm going to push back on LSAC a little bit. The schools can't use the writing sample because it isn't standardized. I mean, maybe everyone answers the same prompt, but there's no rubric for grading it. They would have to read each individual one to find out what you wrote. What I propose is that the LSAT should incorporate a writing section that is scored. And it shouldn't be a free form write, a long essay, argue for this or that. It should be really particular. Can you explain the assumption of this argument? Can you explain the weaknesses of this legal case? Can you, in one paragraph, articulate an argument for this conclusion? I think that would be really telling because when I ask students to do this in tutoring, they're typically horrible at it. And it's by building this skill that we get really good at logic games, LR and RC. I teach them how to speak logically and how to write persuasively. And then the right answers stand out because they know what they would say if they were in the position of having to strengthen, weaken the argument, articulate its assumptions, etc. All right, the next skill, organizing evidence into argument, LR, RC, and writing. Of course, that is the fundamental job of the lawyer. Deductive reasoning is the next one. And I think that the LSAT tries so hard to test deductive reasoning, and the test prep companies try equally hard to obscure it from you, to make it seem like it's something else that they have the answer to, but it's not. Deductive logic goes all the way back to Aristotle. You don't really need power score to understand the argumentative forms on the LSAT, but you do have to be willing to adopt some models that you may not have been taught in the past. All right, the next skill, writing with good organizational structure. Nowhere does the LSAT teach you this. And when students get to law school, what are they bad at? IRAC, writing. Why can't we start to teach students this as a component of the LSAT and start to test it as part of the admission? As I was preparing this presentation, it occurred to me that I've solved the whole problem. The problem with the LSAT is that it has no written component. It's purely multiple choice. When so much of the job and work that you do in law school and as an attorney involves taking the next step, not just identifying assumptions, good arguments, bad arguments, and inferences, but being able to articulate them in writing or in words. All right, the next one, writing concisely and clearly, of course. I mean, a lot of this comes down to writing. So if we could come up with a way to test writing in a, in a format that with a rigorous rubric, I think that that would be a very strong addition to the LSAT. All right, four more skills to round out our list of 15 here. Law professors also say interpreting statutes in relation to a case is important. That's what I was talking about above. How do the facts relate to the rules? The next one, identifying the rule of law. I love this skill, and I think that it is tested very well on LR if you understand what they're up to. 2/3 of the arguments on the LR section, a majority of them, I don't know the exact number, many of the arguments on the LR section are flawed because they're missing a major premise. They give you all the facts for the argument, but they don't give you a rule that lets you get from those facts to the conclusion that they try to draw. And that strikes me as very similar to almost every case that I've ever read. They give you a few rules and they give you a few facts and then they reach a conclusion, but rarely does it have the rigor of a deductive proof. There's usually some gaps in the logic. And it's the job of the attorney to be able to craft a rule and say, sure, the court didn't say it, but the rule must be this, or those decisions wouldn't make sense. I can identify the rule by looking at this body of cases. That's the essential job of the lawyer. And I think that skill really begins for many people on the LR section when they're asked to find the assumptions of arguments. Can you figure out the rule that would allow you to get from these facts to that conclusion? All right, and then the next one I want to talk about for a little bit, the LSAT, or the one of the skills that's tested in law school is allocating available time to tasks based on priorities, time management. And if you notice, LSAC says all sections of the LSAT test this skill. I think I would agree. And if I had to say which of the skills on this list is the most important one that the LSAT is testing, it's this one. Every single semester, I have students who, well, let me back up a second. Every single cycle, I have students who underperform on the LSAT and then tell me, I'm going to law school anyway. I'm going to take my 142 and I'm going to go to third tier law school X. And thanks for the advice, but I'm going to reject it and go. Every single semester, several of those students contact me after they get their fall grades or spring grades and say, I am on the verge of academic probation. I'm about to fail out. Can you help me? And it happened yesterday. A student contacted me and said, I've gotten all C's and the school wants me to come up with a plan so that they don't kick me out because I'm not, performing well. And I don't think the student is dumb. I think the student is very intelligent and could have developed those skills with more LSAT prep. But now we're playing catch up. Now we've got to learn those skills over the next 15 days and put a plan together and meet once a week for the next semester, or else things aren't going to go well and the committee's not going to let the students stay. So that's a lot of pressure. It would be so much better to just take the LSAT as an opportunity to learn these skills. And that's one of the biggest ones. Can you learn how to prioritize and manage your time when there isn't enough time to do everything? Some people just can't handle that. I can't do it all. It's not fair. That's what they're testing. What will you do when you can't do everything you need to do? Are you going to be able to figure out which are the highest priority things and do those first? Or are you just going to forge straight ahead and miss deadlines? Because some attorneys will do that. Some attorneys will miss deadlines. They're working so hard on one case, they don't think about their others, and then they're facing, malpractice claims. All right, the last point here, identifying the key points in lectures and class discussions. I'm not so sure how LR and RC are testing that skill, but whatever, LSAC thinks so. And that's not a bullet point that I'm particularly interested in discussing, so we can move on. All right, I just have a few more slides, so bear with me and then I will let you guys jump in with questions. I want to give you guys my own perspective. But then I want to buttress it with a little bit of data. I spent 2 years studying for the LSAT, and I didn't think it should take that long. I was an MCAT teacher. I was a very good test taker. I figured if anyone can learn this in 3 months, it's me. But I couldn't. And it bugged me. I kind of feel like Steve Schwartz when I tell this story. He said, I just couldn't get it, and I didn't know why. And it bugged me so much that I spent the next 20 years, making that my career. But in order to get the score that I needed, it took me about 2 years. But the reward for that was that I applied to law school, got into my top choice, and got a full scholarship. And so at the end, it seemed like the reward had really justified all of the effort. And I try to go out and beat that drum and tell people, I think this is the right path. The other thing is that because I had come into the application process so confident and with such a strong offer, that I was able to spend the summer really getting ready for law school. I did law preview class with Barbary. I read, some of the books that people talk about in the group, One Hell of a Ride, and, et cetera, et cetera. And so my first semester, I don't want to say it was a cakewalk. I worked really hard, but I destroyed my grades. They were awesome. And it carried me all the way through law school. Just coming out of the gates and getting really good grades that first semester set the tone for the entire thing. In fact, that one semester led to me getting onto law review, and I eventually became an editor. And if you're on law review, it gives you connections to job opportunities. And so even though I'm a really horrible interviewer, I managed to sneak into a prestigious firm somehow, and I fooled them. I told them I would love it, and I hated it. But you know what? I didn't harm myself because I had minimized my debt. And so after a year of practicing law, when I realized I wasn't happy with my career, I returned to education with no problem. I know people say, I want to do public interest work. I want to do this kind of work. If you're a slave to firm work, you can't do that stuff. And so going to school with a scholarship and taking the LSAT seriously honestly becomes the vehicle for doing the things that you want to do, the things that you think the LSAT is stopping you from doing. That's the irony of it, is that the LSAT is the tool that can enable you to do all those things. So, people rush to attend law school with low LSAT scores. And now they're contacting me. I told this story a slide too soon. But that's not the end of the road. Some of them get through law school. They're kind of fake it. And there are supplements. There are ways to, work on, just like on the LSAT, there's ways to pretend like you've done the work when you haven't. So some people get through law school and then they fail the bar exam and then they contact me. And the further down the road they go before the gaps in their education become exposed, the more it hurts them. When I worked in bar prep, I met people who had taken the bar exam many times and spent a lot of money and were many hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt and whose careers were completely stalled. And I know from my own experience buying homes and cars that they look carefully at your student loans. The debt to income ratio is very important. And so, the people I've worked with in the past, I have a lot of sympathy for because I know that their home lives have been impacted negatively by the decision to go to law school. And I meet a lot of people when I was in bar prep. I met a lot of people who, for whom that was their story. That's what caused me to start looking into the statistics. I don't want to be Professor Harvey and say, look at my story. I aced the LSAT. You should too. And I also don't want to say, I know a few students who got really harmed, and therefore you will too. I went and read every study I could. And consistently, the studies show a correlation between the LSAT and first year grades in law school. Consistently, the studies show a correlation between LSAT score and bar passage rate. Now, admittedly, there aren't a lot of studies. There's a half a dozen to a dozen statistical studies out there, but they're perfectly consistent. Not one of them says, nah, doesn't matter. Everyone that I know of shows the same correlation. Now, it's not a perfect correlation. In fact, it's not even as high as LSAC wants it to be. I've read that they wanted the correlation to be 0.5 or 0.7 or something like that, and it's kind of a meager 0.3. But there is a correlation. There is something about the LSAT, some skills that it is testing that overlap with the skills that you'll need during your first year. And some of the skills that the LSAT is testing overlap with the bar exam. I mean, the bar exam has a multiple choice section as of now, although it may go away. But as of now, the connection between the multiple choice skills that you can develop here and the multiple choice skills that you'll need for the MBE are pretty clear to me. Okay, couple more slides. What should the LSAT be testing in terms of content? Right now, I think the content of the LSAT is really spectacular. It tests natural sciences, physical sciences, and biology. These are things that you must be aware of to be an attorney in certain, cutting edge areas of law, or even if you don't intend to practice in those areas of law, how will you take intellectual property if you can't understand some science principles? The social sciences are heavily represented on LR and reading comp, philosophy, history, political science, economics, archaeology, sociology, psychology. These are all the scholarly disciplines of the modern world. That's what we want educated people to know about. And the humanities in particular, I think the LSAT does a terrific job of being inclusive of minority viewpoints. How many passages are there about minority literature, minority art, minority dance? There is even passages about minority law. I'm thinking about the Native American passage about the wampum belts and the Confederation. So in terms of content, I am typically very, very fond of the LSAT. I think they do a good job of selecting things from the relevant scholarly disciplines in modern American culture. So what's the problem then? Let's talk about question 14 from the RC section of PT 91. This particular question I find to be really fascinating. And I think that I've seen it before, as I mentioned to my students about 12 years ago. I took the LSAT in February 2000, whoops, total typo here, 2009. That's wishful thinking that I'd been taking the LSAT in 2019. In 2009, I took the February LSAT. And at that time, the February LSAT was always undisclosed. So after the exam, everybody wants to go chat about it, but we're not supposed to, and there's no official exam, to look at. But I remember that there used to be a website called toplawschools.com. It still exists actually, but it's not no longer the go-to place for LSAT discussions. But at any rate, I was on that website after the exam talking to other students, and a particular question came up that became hotly debated in this thread. I went back and tried to find the thread on top law schools, and it doesn't seem to exist, which doesn't surprise me because we may have been breaking the rules a little bit by discussing the contents of the exam. And so frequently the forum moderators will just delete those threads so that LSAC doesn't get peeved. But at any rate, I remember the discussion. You can't erase my memory so easily. So what's the question? Here it is. They're asking us about the relationship between passage A and passage B. Nothing wrong with that. And these passages are about markets. Nothing wrong with that. It's economics. We just said that that was fair game for modern scholarly discourse in, American liberal arts education. But then the question asks us for an analogy, something that doesn't have to do directly with markets. And I don't have a problem with analogies either. I think that reasoning through analogy is part of the job of an attorney. You don't always have a case that's perfectly on point. You sometimes have to make arguments via analogy. But here's the problem. Look at answer choice B, a thermostat and a thermometer. This is the answer that I argued was correct, incidentally, B, in my discussions in the forum 12 years ago. But we had no way to know for sure because remember, this was the non-disclosed February exam. So there was no satisfaction to the discussion. We couldn't say, yeah, that was the correct answer and here's why. We were just left with sort of competing arguments on both sides. But among the people who objected to that answer choice, some of them said that they didn't pick it because they didn't know the meaning of the word thermostat. And I remember kind of scoffing at that and thinking, who doesn't know what a thermostat is? I mean, even as like a kid, I would go fiddle with the thermostat in the house. But there were people in the thread saying I didn't have a thermostat when I grew up. We don't have thermostats in, insert your country here. So I started thinking about this. I had taught for many years in El Paso, a border city. I was a high school teacher there. And I remember some of my high school students used to come over the border every single day for school. It would take them a couple hours to cross, and they'd attend school all day and then cross back. And regardless of my personal views of, political views at the border, I learned to have a lot of sympathy for those students. They worked really hard to be there and to get that education. So I think about them growing up poor in Mexico, coming over the border every day. I wonder how many of them had thermostats in their house or running water or electricity. Some of them didn't. I can see that as being a cultural difficulty, not just being familiar with the tool. And what's worse is that ordinarily when students tell me I didn't know this about markets, I say, well, that's unfortunate, but it was in the passage. So, suck it up, buttercup, you read more carefully, like Brad Barbie would say. But when the word appears in the answer choice with no context, what can you do? You know it or you don't. So, we could say, all right, yeah, but shouldn't you know what a thermostat is? Even if you don't have a thermostat in your house, they're everywhere. There's thermostats in your car. There's one in your oven. There's one in your hair dryer. Yeah, that's true. But, do we really know how all of the devices work that we use? I went and did a quick Google search for like parts of a car. And I said, what if that answer choice had said this? That the analogy between passage A and B was similar to the relationship between a valve spring and a rocker arm. If it had said that, even as someone who works on my own vehicle, I would have to admit I'd be left scratching my head thinking, what the hell is the relationship between a valve spring and a rocker arm? It would take me a little while to figure it out if I even could. And is it fair to say, well, come on, Keith, you drive a car every day. It's right there. It's working in the motor. You should know what those things are. I don't find that to be a compelling argument that just because it's in my car, I should know how it works, or that it's part of the scholarly discourse that I should be familiar with to get into law school. So this term is really interesting to me. So then I think, okay, well, can we get out of the difficulty by saying, yeah, well, if you just knew your Latin roots, you could figure out the meaning of the word. I mean, thermometer, we could figure out, even if we didn't know. Thermo is heat and meter means measure. Here we have the same, introduction. Thermo is temperature. But what about stat? I mean, that is a rather obscure Latin root. I'm pretty good with vocabulary, but I'll have to admit I had to go to Merriam-Webster to figure out the etymology of the word thermostat. Stat was from a Latin root that meant one who steadies. And then the example that they gave was, for example, thermostat. Well, then what the heck? There truly is no context for this word. A thermostat is a thermostat. That's it. You know it or you don't. Um, so I'm not saying for sure that this question is unfair. I don't know if it's fair or not fair. What I'm saying is that it's very thought provoking. The idea of a concept that is undefined, that isn't part of our regular scholarly discourse, but that is crucial to getting a question right. Now, it's just one question, one point. You could retake the LSAT, but how many times does this happen over and over and over on each test? I don't know. I just know of this one example. I think in general, LSAC does a very good job of either defining obscure terms or not, or writing questions that don't require you to know the definition of the obscure term. Usually you can figure it out from the context if you don't know it. But on the other hand, you do have to have a strong English vocabulary to be good at the LSAT. So what is the line? Where do we draw the line between strong English vocabulary and obscure technical term? I don't know the answer to that, and it's an interesting question. One of the things that I think is a compelling argument, though, has to do with this Campbell's law. If the LSAT is the way we're going to measure the skills necessary to get into law school, it's problematic when the LSAT score becomes the target. In other words, when you as the student say, I want a high LSAT score, then that incentivizes LSAT prep companies, and you have an incentive to just get the high score at whatever cost. And what this means is that now we have an incentive to figure out ways to get the high score, even if they don't actually correlate with the skills that the test was intended to measure. You don't actually have to become a better reader to get a better LSAT score. You can just read PowerScore's book and you'll know a few tricks. Or you can just diagram it like this and your score will go up 5 or 10 points. But those are kind of artificial increases because you haven't actually learned very much about deductive logic or rhetoric or etc. So that's how the measure becomes corrupted. You become able to manipulate the score without manipulating the skill. But I think where people mistake that, what it means is that some high scores don't actually have the skills we want them to have. But I think that people misinterpret that because they say, oh, well, then that must mean that some low scores do have those skills. I think that that's generally untrue. I think that low scores typically do not have strong reading skills and strong reasoning skills, even if there are high scores that also lack those skills. And here's why, because someone who has excellent reading skills will always get a good score, regardless of the amount of prep they do or what materials they use. You notice there are just some people out there who a few months in, they're like, yep, got it, ready for the test. And then the rest of us are like, wait, what? What did they use? I want that secret sauce. And the secret is that they had excellent reading skills that the rest of us didn't have going into the process. And therefore, we're not going to be able to replicate that, that same path to success. We have to go back and build the skills. So that leads to my final slide. I mean, what is my real message that I want people to take home from this? It's triple review. It's the apple of my 20 years of work. How do I think you should study the LSAT? You should try to learn the root skills and ignore your score. It's so difficult to do because the root skills can be rather boring, and the score is where you really get your bragging rights. But I promise there's some method to this madness. So the root skills that I'm talking about are English vocabulary, English grammar. You should be really good at the two. Whether you agree with whether they should test this or not, they do. And becoming strong in those areas will help you. You should learn how to reason deductively. Strong deductive logic is required. You should learn about Aristotle's model of syllogism and the related idea of enthymeme. What happens when you remove a portion of the valid syllogism? And then finally, here's the thing that I don't hear anyone at all talking about in the LSAT prep market. What about the principle of charity? Going all the way back to the beginning of this presentation, how do you read carefully? How do you read critically? This is my response to it. You read charitably. A good reader tries to determine the writer's intent. What is this meant to convey, regardless of what forms or conventions or meanings I want to impose of it? What does that person want to say to me? If you can figure that out, nothing else matters. I mean, really good LSAT takers can do it. They can read the argument and say, ah, well, what it really means is this. And then everyone else is like, whoa, that's excellent. And it's the ability, developing that skill, the ability to read it and say, oh, here's what it means. That's the essence of LSAT logic. So the philosophy that I employ is triple review. I treat the LSAT exams like puzzles that enable you to learn new skills. My granddaughter doesn't do a puzzle once. She does it, 10 times in a row, and then 10 times the next day, and 10 times the day after that. And even when she's mastered the puzzle, it's still fun for her to do it again. That's how you really learn how the puzzle works. So triple review is about a certain amount of repetition. And the real fascinating thing about triple review is that if you're just willing to take your eye off the score and focus on the score goes up. You don't even have to worry about it, but you have to worry about the skills. More importantly, triple review makes you a better reader and a better thinker. And ultimately, that's the thing that I think translates to success in law school. Can you articulate what you're thinking? Can you formulate your own thoughts, formulate your own answers to these questions? Because in law school, you will find fewer and fewer multiple choice tests and more exams that require you to write out your thoughts in paragraph form. So using triple review is a way to learn these skills using the LSAT as a puzzle. And then ultimately, when you're done with the process, the score will be there. That's sort of a byproduct of learning a bunch of interesting things that will help springboard you to success in law school and on the bar exam. All right, so that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to stop the recording